Welcome back to another Cyber Free Lab. This time, we're going to be looking at Introduction to AWS IAM Enumeration, and more specifically, we're going to use the AWS CLI to enumerate information about users, groups, roles, and their permissions that they inherit through different types of policies. So we're going to take a look at all that in this free lab that you can access at this URL. Now, if you haven't already started the lab, go ahead and start it so you can get your access key ID, your secret access key, as well as the username, but I'll show you a way to retrieve this information even if we hadn't received it through this interface. By now, you're already familiar with how to configure your CLI because you did that in the prior lesson. And so as a reminder, we're going to do AWS configure. You could always pass in a profile name if you wanted, but in my case, I'm going to skip that step. Instead, I'm going to go straight to copy pasting my credentials. And then I'm going to make sure that I'm in the US East 1 region, and I'll just use the JSON format, which, as you know by now, is my personal preference. So now that we have our profile configured, a good thing to do to verify that we're using who or what we think we're using is the good old whoami call, which is get caller identity, which we'll submit now. So from this, we get three pieces of information. We get our user ID, we get the AWS account ID, and this would be helpful in determining the scope of what we're looking at. And then of course we get our ARN, which is the Amazon resource name. And in this case, we are authenticating through an IAM user, and the IAM user is this long name here, which is -Joel. So we would want to take note of this. We'd want to write down this information and then go from there. Now, if we think or we know that we're a user, there's another command that we can issue to verify that, but we have to have access to this command, and it's IAM get user. And this will return information about the current user that we're authenticated as. So we'll get basically the same response or same information, give or take a couple of different details like tags, creation date, path, and things like that. But the reason that usually people for day-to-day operations or even attackers will use the get caller identity command instead is because you cannot deny this command. It's a permission that's allowed by default because there's no way to deny this through policies. Even if you were to create a deny statement for it, you'd still be allowed to do it. And the reasoning behind that AWS has shared with the public is because if you get access denied errors or error messages back from the AWS API, you'd be able to get this information anyway. So this is not considered to be private information as long as you have proper access keys or credentials to be able to make this call. So keep that in mind. This one could be blocked. In this case, it's not. In this case, we have permissions to run get user. But if you don't have that permission, you can still do enumeration by using this command here. So again, something to note and remember and keep in mind as you're progressing throughout our labs and throughout our courses. Since we now know for a fact that IAM users are being used in this AWS environment, what we can do is we can try to list various users to see if there are any others or if we're the only user in this environment. And we can do that by running that command of AWS IAM list -users. And as you can see, there are multiple users in this environment. There's a user Chris, there's my user Joel, there's a user Mary, Mike, and then you'll see this colon here with the blinking cursor, which means that there's more information that we can scroll down with our arrow keys on the keyboard in order to access. And once you get to the very end, then it will end and you can press Q in order to exit out of that interactive mode. So whenever you're scrolling on the terminal, that's a quick tip for what you can do. But again, there's a user Mary as well as user Mike. So there are, I think, 4 different users in this AWS environment, which again, we would want to document and write down in our notes. Then something else we can do is we can try to list access keys for users. So we could do list access key. And by doing that without providing anything else, it will return our users' access keys, which you can see here. We have this access key that we are using to authenticate. There's only one access key that's associated with this user. We could also, if we have permissions, use this command to list access key IDs for the other users in this environment. But I'll go ahead and skip that step just for the sake of time. Feel free to try doing that if you would like. Next, let's go ahead and try to enumerate the user policies that we have for our IAM user, which I can do with IAM list user policies. We'll pass in my username, which I have autocomplete here, which helps a lot with that, but otherwise you can copy it from the above command here, and then I'll go ahead and paste it in. And this will return just an array of policy names that we have, because we can have multiple different policies that are attached to us or assigned to us. In this case, I only have one, and the name of it is allow enumerate roles, which I can now use to retrieve that policy. So I'll do IAM get user policy. I'll pass in the username, which again, I've already copied. And then I'll pass in the policy name, which is this one right here. And paste that in, and then we'll press enter. That actually retrieves the contents of that policy. So we can see the username, policy name, policy document, and then the statement with 4 different actions. So we have IAM get role policy, list roles, and list role policies for all resources, and an effect of allow. So that's part of what gives us permissions to be running some of these commands against the AWS API in this AWS environment. However, that's not the only permissions that we have, obviously, because we've been running some other commands that are not listed here. So where are we getting those other permissions from, and why aren't we seeing them there? The reason is because right now we're only listing inline policies, which are directly attached to our user. We are not looking at attached managed policies that are either AWS managed or customer managed, and that requires a completely different command to be issued to list those out. That's very important to keep in mind when you're running security assessments, because if you're only listing inline policies or you're only listing managed policies, you're only looking at part of the overall picture. So let's go ahead and list our attached user policies as well. We'll type AWS IAM list attached user policies. We'll pass in our username again. And I forgot to change what I copied. So we can grab that back up here. And let's press enter. Now we can see that there's no attached policies. We get a completely blank array, which means that this user Joel doesn't have any attached managed policies, but it's still worth checking because again, we have more permissions than we were able to see with this command here. So again, if we don't have any attached managed policies, but we have more permissions, how is that possible? Remember that in AWS, oftentimes IAM users are part of IAM groups. That's a best practice for receiving permissions because groups can then themselves have either inline or managed policies. And so this is telling me that I'm probably part of a group. To check that, I can do a few things. The first one we'll look at is AWS IAM list groups. And this will list all of the groups in the AWS account. And we can see that there are 2. There's a developers group and there's an infrastructure group. So how can I tell which one that I'm a part of, that my Joel user is part of? There's a simple command we can issue, which is AWS IAM list groups for user. And then again, we'll pass in our username, paste that in, and then press enter. And now this will tell us what group or groups, because I could be part of multiple groups, that I'm part of. In this case, I am part of the developers group. So that gives me information that I can now try to retrieve using this group name. For example, I can do AWS IAM list group policies, and then we'll pass in a group name. And I want to copy and paste the group that I'm a part of. So I'll do this. And now we can see that there's a policy assigned to this group, and there's the name of it that we can copy. And again, we'll retrieve that with get group policy, the group name, which I think is this one. Yep, developers. And then we'll pass in the policy name, which I just copied, and we'll paste in here. Now we get a lot more information and we can see what I was talking about. We can see that our Joel user who is part of this group has access to more permissions than we were able to see by just looking at Joel's inline policies, including the ability to list access keys for multiple different users, which is interesting and should be a little bit of a red flag. And then we have all these actions here for IAM, which is what has been allowing us to run most, if not all, of these commands that we've been running in this lab. So we are inheriting these permissions by being part of this group. I'll press Q to exit out of interactive mode so that we can keep going. We could also do the same thing for the other group, and or we could check to see if there's any attached group policies to this group, just like we did for our IAM user, but using a slightly different command. Instead of showing you that for the sake of time, I'll let you explore that on your own and try to figure out which commands are used for that purpose. But instead, what I want to do is I want to move on to showing you how to enumerate information about IAM roles. So let's go ahead and do that now. You might remember from our prior lesson that we can use IAM list roles, and that will list what roles are in this account, which we can see can be quite a few different roles, and not all of which we might be interested in. So instead, what we can do is we can try to list more specific roles, especially if we know the name of the role to begin with, and we can do that. And in fact, let me go ahead and clear the screen so we can start from the top. We can do that with AWS IAM list roles, and then we'll pass in a query to filter our results, and we'll do roles, role name. And keep in mind, this is case sensitive. So if you have even just a tiny little bit of a typo, it's not going to work. And then we'll do support role and then close that out. Let's go ahead and press enter, and hopefully I don't have any typos. All right, looks like that went through, which is great. Now we can see information about the support role, including what's allowed in the assume role policy document, which dictates who is allowed to assume this role. This is interesting because we can see that our Joel user doesn't have access to this support role, but the user Mary does have access to assume this role. So if I were an attacker and I found these credentials in the wild, and I'm assuming, or I'm authenticating, I should say, as the IAM user Joel, I wouldn't be able to access this role. But if this role would allow for higher privileges, I'd be interested in seeing if there's any way that I can instead hijack this Mary user, or maybe even modify this assume role policy document, right? You have to start thinking like an attacker. How can I leverage the access that I have to escalate my privileges or move through this account and just see what's possible and what's not possible? It kind of turns into a little bit of a game, and enumeration is the step that shows us what's allowed or how this AWS environment is configured in the first place. And that's really your starting point. Without visibility, you have this fog of war. You can't see around the corner. You can't understand what's there or how to potentially exploit it. And so that's why enumeration is so very important. Before we wrap up really quickly here, let's run a couple more commands against this role. For example, let's do AWS IAM list role policies, since we're in the process of listing policies for everything right now. And we'll do role name of support role. And we'll get back the policy name for this role to see if it's worth even trying to pursue as an attacker or as a security researcher. So we can now try to get this policy. We'll do get role policy. This is the same that we've been doing from the very beginning of this lesson. It's just dealing with users versus groups versus roles. In this case, we're passing in the policy name of this guy right here. And then we'll press enter. And we can see that this has full S3 access to all S3 actions and all S3 resources within this account, which is basically an admin level role for Amazon S3. If there's any sensitive data in buckets stored in this account, an attacker would love to be able to access that, which now makes this support role a very juicy target for pretty much any threat actor that, again, maybe found these credentials in the wild. So on the defensive side, right? On the offense side, we've been talking about what you can do with that. On the defensive side, if I'm looking at this, I see the opposite of least privilege. I see overly privileged. A support role probably does not, in fact, not probably, a support role does not need this level of access. So if I'm checking the security of this environment, I would report this as an issue, and I would propose a solution to really figure out what this role actually needs access to versus what it currently has, and then close that gap by updating this policy right here. So something to think about and something to note. And again, this is another reason that highlights why enumeration is so important on both the defensive side and the offensive side. But that's it. We've now looked at how to get started with AWS IAM enumeration for multiple different types of entities in AWS. You can go ahead and complete this lab and move on to the next.